want to start with some thanks. It's the first time I've been here. It's the first time I've had a chance to speak with a group of people where everybody seems to know Aristotle already. And I spend my entire life banging on, it seems, to people who know nothing about Aristotle, and certainly nothing about Aquinas, that you really should know something about these people. It's a very lonely existence. Particularly when analytic metaphysics and Darwinian philosophy of biology just doesn't really have any time for us, despite the fact that they really should be making the time. They don't quite know it yet, but we're working. They'll get there eventually. Also want to thanks for the just the chance to be here today. I think we've already had our money's worth from the first talk. I've tried to stay away from physics for a good number of years now, and it's nice to know there's someone doing the same thing. Very nice. I'm going to have to read up on quantum mechanics. If suddenly I can say that quantum mechanics is okay for Aristotelians, I'm going to be in a much stronger position dealing with Darwin, because they'll always bowing down to quantum mechanics. It'll be useful rhetorical tool. Because of the nature of the circle that I tend to work in, I'm always trying to bring the good news of Aristotle and Aquinas to people who don't know anything about it. And that tends to be, requires that I focus on the bits that they will eventually, hopefully, appreciate and like. Those bits that are compatible with what they're doing, or solve problems that they have, that they recognize. What I want to do today is something slightly different. It's not something I've done before in the usual context, and that's to bring up a problem between the metaphysics of Aristotle and Aquinas and the scholastics generally. This is principle of proportionate causation, which, at least on the face of it, doesn't fit very well with some of the basic facts of evolutionary biology. So what I'm going to want to do today is sketch the problem. Further apologies, I mean, you've been doing a lot of this, so if you've been attending the other talks in the series, and the other one just 2 days ago, this might be familiar. Hopefully it will be fairly familiar. I'm going to try to sketch the problem as I see it, and say something about it which we'll see. We'll see whether it flies or not. This is essentially the task I'm going to try to do. To show that the miracle isn't a miracle in any scary sense. Any sense that a signed-up Darwinian needs to be scared about. Which I need to be able to do, because I mean, they're not going to get scared by Thomistic metaphysics. They're just going to say, there you go. So it's a kind of hurdle that they don't know about, but we need to get over. We're going to continue our conversations with that. Before we get started on the biology, it's probably worthwhile just reminding ourselves that we've been here before, in the sense that the principle of proportionate causality has raised tricky questions. I take this from the Summa. The quote: "A living thing is more perfect than that which merely exists, an intelligent thing than what merely lives. Therefore life is more perfect than existence, knowledge than life. But the essence of God is existence itself. Therefore he has not the perfections of life, knowledge, and other similar perfections," despite being first cause. And Aquinas has to come up with something to say about this, and he makes the move to pre-existing virtually. Things, properties can pre-exist virtually in the causes. They don't have to be there actually, but as long as they're there virtually, we can save the principle and save our blushes. This is going to come up again, because this notion of pre-existing virtually is going to, some are going to find it attractive in our context in biology. I'm going to try to not lean too heavily on it, just because I think this could be letting us off the hook very quickly and very easily. I could just say anything pre-exists virtually in the cause, and how's anyone going to be any the wiser? So I'm going to try to not lean too hard on that that principle, but it's just worth reminding ourselves that we've had something like this conversation before.
Who stated that? The top?
That is the I think it's the second objection in the question question 4, Article 2. He doesn't give us a name. In our context, getting into the biology, I find it's worthwhile to start with this quote, just to give us a sense of what the problem is supposed to be, what the miracle is supposed to be. Overall, what the field of protein evolution needs are some plausible solid hypotheses to explain how random sequences of amino acids turned into sophisticated entities we recognize today as proteins. Till that happens, the phenomenon of the rise of proteins will remain something close to a miracle. And for those of you who spend any time looking at evolutionary theory, the major transitions that we think have occurred, if you don't get the proteins, there isn't much to get working with. So this is a fundamental early stage in the evolutionary process. And at that point, we still don't have anything that looks like a plausible hypothesis. And so we've got someone who should know, calling this something close to a miracle, that we have proteins at all. And there have been people who jump on this admission quite readily. Douglas Axe, who, as you'll see, giving you some papers here, is publishing in very respectable places. This is not shoddy stuff, but Axe has calculated that according chances here are vanishingly small that we can get proteins through natural processes. That's the way he wrote it out, and I found it particularly impressive. 6 trillions there makes it feel very small. This is really not going to happen. So just to start here, I just want to say that there's 2 senses of miracle we need to keep clear on, and that is, the first is I think the sense that we're getting from the biologist, that is, miracle is an extremely improbable event given what we know, given what we think we know. And then there's another sense, an event requiring divine intervention. And I think what happens a lot is that we move from a miracle, sense A, to a miracle in sense B. This is certainly what Douglas Axe does. Because it's so difficult to explain the rise of proteins, the chances of it happening naturally are so vanishingly small, the best explanation for the existence of proteins is, well, we had a miracle in sense B. It's not surprising that the chances of it happening on its own are so small. You actually need divine intervention for that to happen because it's metaphysically impossible. It's not just unlikely, it's metaphysically impossible. And that's the kind of thing that I'm going to want to be looking at today. And as an Aristotelian, as a scholastic, I might feel the temptation to go to miracle in the strong sense quickly. I want to resist that temptation. If we're going to do that, we're really not going to have conversations with too many people in the analytic community. We're not going to be talking to too many biologists. So I go back to a version of Occam's razor. It's not just that we should cut down on the number of entities that we appeal to when we're trying to provide explanations, but let's go for the simplest explanation. In this case, it's the least cause. that we should be shooting for in any particular context. When explaining a phenomena, the least cause capable of explaining the phenomena must be accepted. I got this from Boulter's Summary of Scholastic Principles. That's really quite nice. So what I'm going to want to try to push is this thesis: there is as yet no need to posit a divine hand in evolutionary matters. That's what I'm shooting for. And part of the interest of this kind of project is, clearly, if my attempts fail, we still have a fallback solution, right? We might have to go back to God. Fine. But at least we won't have gone back prematurely. We'll have gone through the necessary legal procedures, you might say, exhausting all the other possibilities. So essentially, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the challenge. I want to get clear on the nature of the challenge that we're supposed to be looking at. Just to remind ourselves of the major evolutionary transitions. Say something a bit more definite about the principle of proportionate causation, what it can mean, what it shouldn't mean, what it has to mean if it's going to be significant. Then I wanted to start getting clearer on the notion of perfection, because that's going to be something that comes up in our conversation about causation, and distinguish two hierarchies of being. And then, once we've got those two hierarchies of being, we've got two kinds of perfections that might be considered in isolation from each other. I'm going to want to say something about both of those hierarchies, and ending with this notion that we need to revisit our interpretation of perfections. I don't want to throw it out. I'm an old-fashioned Aristotelian. When I have an endoxa or an aporia, I want to save as many of the endoxa as possible, and certainly the most authoritative. And so if I can keep the tweaking of our principles to a bare minimum, that's what I'll count that as a success, and I will have proven the case sufficiently, as he says. Okay, what is the problem? The problem is that propositions 1, 2, and 3 look to be independently convincing and compelling, but like in all aporia, when you put them together, you start to realize there's at least a prima facie tension here. There's a contradiction here. It doesn't look obvious as to how all three propositions at the same time can be true. So, what are these? Proposition 1, evolution on this planet has involved a series of fundamental transitions in which entities with new powers and operations have arisen from a causal base lacking those powers and operations. We start from a state of the planet where nothing is alive, abiotic. Life gets started, that's a major transition. Life has a number of forms, and it will, as we see in a minute, have a look at the slide, life takes on different arrangements, styles, whatnot. And as we go through, new powers, new operations emerge, arising from a causal base lacking those powers and operations. 2, these new powers and operations include life, sentience, rationality, properties that are deemed perfections in the Neo-Aristotelian scholastic metaphysics. And then 3, the principle of proportionate causality says every effect must have an adequate cause, a cause that is sufficiently perfect, sufficiently high on the scale of being to have the power to produce the effect. The cause cannot give what it doesn't have. And the problem is, bottom here, a transition from lower to higher levels of perfection is a gift from above. It cannot be an unaided evolution from below. That's the problem. But when we read one, certainly when I go into the biology department, they're going to read that in a naturalistic way. Any talk of gifts from above is not going to fly. So we're left with, well, you can't get them what you think you're getting in the first proposition. But we've got good reasons for thinking that's right. So the problem then is, well, how do you overcome this contradiction? There are only so many ways in which you can solve an aporia. One would be to say, well, it's just an apparent contradiction. There isn't really anything. Once we've understood them aright, everything should go back to the way it was. I'm hoping to do something like that with tweaks to two. Just two things. This is where I'm going to be going with this. The other way of solving an aporia would be to say, well, look, you actually signed up to inconsistent propositions. You don't have a choice. You gotta get rid of something. And so you're going to get people who will be incompatibilists and say, well, this, you can't have it. Sorry. I know you compatibilists would like to have all three simultaneously, but you're going to have to make a choice. What's it going to be? If I'm in the evolutionary biology department, it's pretty clear that I'm not really signed up to two or, frankly, to three. Most of them haven't even heard about the principle of that. You know what they're talking about. So they're saying, well, I haven't got a problem yet. If you are coming from this side, there are both compatibilists and incompatibilists. There are some who are going to say, well, look, you can't resolve this, so much the worse for evolutionary biology. And there are other scholastically minded people who say, well, let's not do that too quickly. I know they get hammered for having a Galileo complex, but I don't think that's entirely fair. I think there's good reasons for wanting to bring some kind of consistency to this, which allows us to maintain all of it. So effectively, that is what I'm going to be shooting for. Just quickly give you transitions that the biologists themselves will talk about. We don't need to spend too much time on this. I will return to this slide later in an effort to suggest that the evolutionary transitions aren't violating our notions of perfections later on. But you know, quick scan of that, you just see there isn't anything there. Well, I took it from them, right? I took it from the biology people, so I'm assuming that the biology people are going to be happy with that. Say a bit more about the principle of proportionate causation. Basic idea is that every effect must have an adequate, efficient cause. Adequate meaning sufficiently perfect, sufficiently high on the scale of being to have the power to produce the effect. An effect cannot be more perfect than its adequate cause. That's the killer. So essentially, if you think that every time you go up the scale in evolutionary transitions that you were going up the scale in perfections, we've got a problem, because it looks as though you're getting the more perfect from the less perfect, and that violates the principle of proportionate causation. Now, I'm going to do some qualifications here. Proportionate causation cannot mean, at least I don't think it means, that you can never get anything completely new or novel from other, between causes and effects. Core intuition is that cause cannot give what it does not have, but that's really a rough guide to the thought. Principle of proportionate causation cannot rule out the emergence of new powers and operations arising from a causal base lacking those powers simply in virtue of their being novel or new in some sense. That would be very, very restrictive, and it means we would have to go back down into chemistry and say, look, it's not biology that's primarily to be held accountable here. If I put oxygen and hydrogen together, I get water. It's got new powers and operations that I don't get in hydrogen and oxygen. Nobody, as far as I know, Jemrick perhaps might want to say, no, we can't even have that. I'm wanting to say to be emergent is not necessarily to be more perfect. If I'm wrong about that, then the chemists are going to have the same problem that we're coping with here. So it won't just be that we're going to be throwing out biology, we'll be potentially throwing out chemistry as well. And then we're really going to have to start asking ourselves whether we want to be signed up to this. That's just a little bit too revisionary. It's one thing to toy with Darwin, it's another thing to toy with multiple natural sciences. I think that we not get a very good hearing outside of centers like this. So what I'm going to draw from that is to be new or emergent isn't necessarily to be more perfect. So what is it actually getting at? Principles usually qualified. We've seen Aquinas do this already. The actuality of the effect is in its adequate cause, not actually and formally, but potentially and virtually. Take that quote from Kofi. And the interesting thing here is that he's distinguishing, presumably, between existing potentially and existing virtually. Might be worth coming back to that as to whether that's right or not. The point, though, two things, is that it saves the principle, but at the cost of having too easy a win. It looks like a cheap win, because I can say, ask, well, what blocks the suggestion that all of the transitional stages are contained in the early stages? Virtually. Now, I don't want to say that that's not an option. I'm just saying it's not the option I want to shoot for right now, because I think it's a little bit easy. Now, in order to justify that, I kind of firm up what a virtual existence is going to mean for me, and it's one of the reasons why I'm not particularly keen on it. And it's already been mentioned today in first talk. When you combine elements into a compound, one of the standard ways of thinking about what's happened is that in this case, hydrogen and the oxygen still exist in the water, but because the operations of hydrogen and oxygen are no longer, well, they're not in operation at that point. Their powers and reliabilities and whatnot have been taken on by the compounded water. But you can still say that the hydrogen and oxygen are not nothing. They exist at least virtually. And here, well, what does that mean? Well, it means I can actually get the oxygen and the hydrogen back. If I break down the water, I get back my hydrogen and my oxygen. And that, for me, is a fairly robust sense of what it is to exist virtually. And I don't think that you can get a very good analogy with the biological transitions if that's the sense of virtue that you're using. It's a bit stiffer, stronger, and as I say, I'm doing this to keep the metaphysical puzzle in play. That's just, for me, I don't think everybody has to go that way, but this is the way I'm trying to get around this problem in a way that will give me some credibility in the biology department. So what exactly is it that a cause cannot give to its effect? And this is where it's perfections that start to come into the picture. Cause cannot give an effect, a perfection that it lacks itself, at least virtually. What are these perfections? And here I'm going to appeal to Scotus's distinction between two kinds of perfections. Perfections in the order of dependence and perfections in the order of eminence. I'm going to take them both separately and see what we have to say. I think it's about the order of dependence that Aquinas is writing things like this. Effects correspond proportionally to their causes, so that we attribute actual effects to actual causes, potential effects to potential causes, particular effects to particular causes, universal effects to universal causes. First action belongs to the first agent. All of that is suggesting that what we're really talking about are the ontological categories that we're putting causes and effects into. And so, if you take this approach to perfections, you get this set of rules. A cause can produce an effect in the same ontological category as itself, or an effect in a category ontologically dependent on it, but you can't go higher. And so you get this kind of thing here. The non-existent cannot cause any being whatsoever. A being of reason cannot be the cause of any real being. Potential being cannot be the efficient cause of an actual being. Compound substances cannot be the efficient cause of simple substances. Accidents cannot be the causes of substances. Contingent substances cannot be the efficient cause of necessary substances. I'm perfectly happy with that. That makes sense to me. And of the orders of perfections, this is the most important as far as my work as a metaphysician is concerned, because this is about what can you do when you're in the various ontological categories. And this one we come back to the transitions, because I don't think any of the transitions that we've been looking at violate that order of perfection. The perfections in the order of ontological dependence are not violated by these moves here. I never get a contingent thing producing a necessary thing, or an accident producing a substance, or a being of reason causing. That never happens. And so there's a quick sigh of relief. You say, well, actually, on one kind of perfection anyway, and arguably a very important kind of perfection, there's no problem to be seen here. Right? Cool. As a compatibilist, you know, that's what I'm shooting for. There is a complication and so I was breathing a sigh of relief in the back during the first talk. And our first speaker was saying that we're not signed up to a form of dualism here. Because if you think that life, sentience, rationality requires some form of non-material component above and beyond purely material component of an organism, then you might get the worry that, hang on a second, you've left out the transition from a wholly material substance to a substance with an immaterial component, and if we put immaterial higher up in the list of perfections, as is standardly done, all right, okay, you do have a violation then. If you're going to bring in the immateriality of the intellect. And this, of course, is a problem, because both Aristotle and Aquinas sign up to the immateriality of the intellect. Yeah, in some of the most torturous passages of Aristotle, Book 3, Chapter 5, and for my money, probably the most torturous parts of Aquinas, Question 75, Article 4. And this is where things can get interesting, because this is the one point, probably the most important point, from a physics point of view anyway, where I depart from both Aquinas and Aristotle. I just think they got this wrong. And one of the reasons I'm fairly comfortable saying that is because Scotus pointed out some difficulties with this way back when. So it's not as though I'm bringing in some kind of post-Cartesian hang-up about dualism. Scotus points out that there's an equivocation involved in the term immaterial. And so the problem that gets Aristotle and Aquinas going, how can a corporeal organ house abstract concepts, seems to play on this conflation of different senses of what it is to be immaterial. And the interesting thing, apart from the merits of this, come back to that in just a second, is that Buridan does the same thing. Well, no, that's not quite right. He never talks about the problem that got Aristotle and Aquinas going in the first place to start producing an immaterial intellect. The whole problem of how a corporeal organ houses an abstract concept does not appear in Buridan at all. And he says that the inflective soul is as organic as the sensitive soul, and the words expressed by Aristotle and Aquinas regarding the nature of abstract concepts goes unmentioned. After providing 4 separate reasons for thinking that the inflective soul cannot be immaterial, he concludes, natural reason would dictate that the human intellect is drawn forth out of the power belonging to matter, and that is generable and corruptible. Now for me, it's that bit there, drawn forth out of the power belonging to matter. That's what I would hope for, being a kind of signed up biologist, but also, I think, a hardcore Aristotelian. I do want to say that the soul is the form of the body. I don't really want to say that it's some extra immaterial component. So that's the complication dealing with the hierarchy of perfections when we take them in the order of ontological dependence. If you want to bring in substance dualism, then you do still have an issue about, well, how does a material thing generate an immaterial component? If I'm right, though, I want to say that the evolutionary transitions that we've been looking at do not involve a violation of the principle of proportionate causation. And as I said, I take that to be the most important of the orders. The question then is, well, what about the order of eminence, perhaps life, sentience, and rationality should be seen as perfections in this order? What might we have to say here? Just to get clear what these perfections are, how they're formally described. Go back to Anselm, one of you. What are perfections? Anything that is better than that which is not it. That which is absolutely and in an unqualified sense better than everything incompatible with it. Scotus, perfection is a notion that includes no imperfection. That's not particularly helpful, but he does give us the example. He gives us an example of wisdom versus ignorance. The idea of wisdom doesn't seem to contain any downside to it. Ignorance obviously has a downside kind of built into it. So that's the way I'm reading Scotus on that. I think that's what he's shooting for. And Aquinas, the good, true, the noble, and other things count as perfections. This is where I want to try something different. And this is where you are going to come in particularly useful for me, because you're the first audience I've trialed this thought on, he said. My claim is the evolutionary transitions involve a trade-off. There's a gain and a loss of perfection, of eminence, and so the transitions do not mark an unqualified increase in perfection. What I'm suggesting is that it's quite natural for us to be looking at the new. It's quite interesting to focus on, well, what is this new organism, what is it able to do, what's it bringing to the game that wasn't there before, and that novelty tends to be the eye-catching feature, and what we tend not to focus on is the cost of having that novelty. I find this particularly difficult to think about because as a North American, I'm unrelentingly, remorselessly optimistic. So I'm always focusing on what's positive, and I've started. This is really destructive of your own kind of sense of personality, to be constantly focusing on the downside of everything for the purposes of the talk. There's been a bit of a personal struggle. But the point here is essentially there in Maynard Smith, in this quote. Came across this. I thought, I think I've thought things like this before about non-biological cases. He says, entities that were capable of independent replication before the transition, this is back to the evolutionary transition, before the transition, could afterwards replicate only as part of a larger whole. Replication, he takes to be one of the outstanding features of life. And what he's pointing out is that independent activity is lost as you go up the scale. And that, I think, is quite interesting, because he then says further down, along with that lack of independence, you're having to carry out your replications with cooperation with other things. The potential for conflict is what we get. The higher up the evolutionary scale you go. So there's internal conflicts in organisms because of this basic fact. Things that used to be independent now have to work together, and their interests are not always aligned. If you're interested in medical issues, well, this is cancer. This is the sorts of things that happen when certain parts of your body decide not to follow, play by the rules, and get a life of their own. So the idea here is, rather than an increase in perfections of eminence as we move through the evolutionary transitions, what we're getting is a conservation of perfection from level to level. Yes, there is something new, something that's worth noting, something that is worth perhaps liking, I don't know. There seems to be a kind of attitudinal element to the notion of perfection. But it doesn't come for free. It's essentially the point. So for example, the first transition from the abiotic to the biotic is the emergence of mistakes. A colleague of mine, Reading, Professor Oderberg, is pushing a new research line as a way of distinguishing the biological sciences from physics and chemistry, precisely on this notion of a mistake. You don't really get mistakes in physics and chemistry. You do get mistakes in biology. Replication isn't accurate. Mutations Things can go wrong. That's new. So life, hooray, mistakes, boo. Perception is another example of a perfection. And the interesting thing about perception is that it seems to have co-evolved with action. It's animals, organisms that have to move around in their environment in order to secure their food, shelter, whatever. You don't get organisms that have perceptual capabilities if they don't have to act in order to keep themselves going. And that need is something that's not felt by the animals, organisms that don't have perception. Plants don't have the need to secure their resource requirements in this way. They're just there. It just happens, and they hope that they get enough sun, but they don't have the need and the anxieties involved of having to move around in their environment, avoiding predation, hoping to find what it is that they need. Another case of a move up the scale for eminence of perfections is the move from sensory experiences of the sensitive soul to the abstract concepts of the intellective soul. We've talked about this already. And I want to suggest that there is a fundamental difference between being able to have abstract concepts and rich perceptual experiences, but it's a sideways move, because in our perceptual experiences, these are informationally rich, and our abstract concepts are informationally impoverished. Hopefully, they're still useful, because they're picking up only those bits of information that suit us, suit what our needs are at the moment. I don't need to pay attention to all of the information that's available to me through visual perception. I'm going to screen some of that out. That's the process of abstraction. Come up with a denuded, informationally denuded mental representation, which is going to be hopefully useful. That's why we do it. But we now have a question of the adequacy of concepts that doesn't arise in the way that we have the adequacy of visual perception. At least if you're living before Descartes' evil demon. Right? Everyone's worried about visual perceptions. If you're going to be talking about defeating skepticism, Aristotelians are not really interested in defeating skepticism there. But we have been concerned, and it's a concern we get throughout the scholastic period, about the adequacy of our concept. Finally, rationality is the root of voluntary action. It's the source of our dignity. It's also the source of our downfall, because this is the root of the possibility of immoral behavior. It's mistakes of a different sort. But one of the nice things about hanging out with animals is that they don't do this. They might misbehave, but they're never little bastards. Way. We are too readily. Put it that way. So yes, we are voluntary agents, but there is a drawback to that. So I don't want to say that these aren't perfections. What I want to say is that they're always balanced. So there's an overall conservation of perfections of eminence as we go through the various stages. And so, really just to wrap up here, what I'm hoping to be able to argue is that, contra the initial impression, evolutionary transitions do not violate the principle of proportionate causation. Because there's no violation of the order of dependence, and there's no violation of the order of eminence, because perfection is conserved rather than increased. And the downside of accepting that approach are these two assumptions you have to make. You have to reject the immateriality of the intellect of the soul, and you have to acknowledge the downside of the perfections of eminence, which is not always a happy thought, and it's not particularly edifying. But I guess for our purposes, the question is it accurate or not? Is it a true account of the way things are? There are other ways, I say, of solving the problem. You can bring God in and say, we can get to higher levels of perfection from lower levels of perfection because divine assistance is granted. Or you can say something along the lines of all perfections are contained in the lower levels virtually, and try to flesh out in a metaphysically strict sense what that might mean. So it's not just a, well, I'll put whatever I want, whatever I need into the virtual existence packet. Spell that out in a way that shows why we can be confident about that connection between the cause and effect, despite the fact that the feature in question is not there actually in the cause. So there are other ways of solving the problem. There's always more than one way to solve a philosophical problem. But this is the way I'm trying to do it, because I'm hoping to be able to keep in touch with what's happening in evolutionary biology, not say anything that's going to be too uncomfortable for their ears. But I must say, I also quite like the consequence of having to take all parts of creation equally seriously. And I quite like that idea. The idea that the inanimate world is as perfect as the animate world. That might actually be the root of an evolutionary ethic. We're having a hard time these days motivating evolutionary ethics, concern, value for things that are inanimate. We're having difficulties, in certain circles anyway, in getting people to take other animals seriously. If something like the conservation of perfection is right, I can meet my house cat on equal terms. You have your perfections, I have my perfections. My perfections aren't quite yours, and yours aren't quite mine, but we're equally perfect in the eyes of God. There's something nice about that.